I have sat on this bench for 39 years, and I have seen institutions fail people in every way an institution can fail a person. I have seen hospitals lose records and schools lose children and banks lose money and governments lose the thread of what they were built to do in the first place. I have seen all of it. I have ruled on all of it. I have gone home after all of it and sat with the particular weight that comes from spending your days at the intersection of what the law says and what is right, and understanding that those two things are not always the same address. But on a Monday morning in November, I saw something that made every other institutional failure I had witnessed in 39 years seem almost forgivable by comparison. Because what I saw that morning was not a system that had broken down through negligence or incompetence or the accumulated failures of many small decisions made by many distracted people. What I saw that morning was a system that had broken a man deliberately, efficiently, and without a single moment of hesitation, and had then spent 18 months defending the breaking of him because admitting the mistake would cost more than continuing to pretend it had never happened. His name was Frank Donahue. He walked into my courtroom that Monday morning in November wearing a dark blue suit that fit him the way suits fit men who bought them for important occasions and wore them carefully and kept them for decades because the occasion that justified. Buying a new one never quite arrived. He was 71 years old. He walked without assistance, steadily, with the particular upright bearing of a man who had spent his working life in physical service and had carried that physicality into old age as a kind of statement about who he was and intended to remain. He sat down and he placed both hands flat on the table in front of him. And he looked at me, and I saw in his face something I had not expected to see. Not anger, though I would have understood anger. Not grief, though I would have understood that too. What I saw in Frank Donahue's face was the particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting something that should never have required fighting and has arrived at the place where the fight is finally going to be decided and does not know yet whether he has enough left to survive the outcome either way. My name is Judge Judy Sheindlin. This is the story of Frank Donahue, and this is the file that changed everything. Frank had joined the Millbrook City Fire Department at the age of 22. He had not grown up dreaming of being a firefighter the way some men do, with the specific childhood certainty that the red trucks and the uniforms and the heroism were what they wanted. He had grown up in a working family in a working neighborhood, and he had looked at the options available to him at 22, and he had seen the fire department, and he had understood instinctively that it was work that mattered. Work that required everything you had. Work that would demand more of him than he imagined he could give and would then demand more still, and he had decided that was exactly the kind of work he wanted to do. He had done it for 40 years. 40 years of shifts and training, and the particular brotherhood of people who go into burning buildings together and come out changed by the going in. He had been a firefighter for 8 years before he was promoted to lieutenant. He had been a lieutenant for 12 years before he was promoted to captain. He had served as captain for the final 20 years of his career, running a station that under his leadership had the lowest injury rate in the department and the highest retention rate, and the kind of culture that people transferred across the city to be part of, because Frank Donahue understood that how you treated the people beside you in the dark determined everything about what happened when the alarm went off. He had retired at 62, not because he was ready to stop, but because his knees had finally made the decision for him after 40 years of stairs and ladders and the accumulated physical cost of work that extracts its payment slowly and completely. He had retired with a ceremony at the station and a dinner at the hall and a speech from the fire chief that had made grown men cry. And he had shaken everyone's hand and hugged the people he loved and driven home and sat in his kitchen and felt the particular silence of a life that has been full of noise and purpose for 40 years and has just become very quiet. He had his pension, $3,100 a month, the pension of a captain with 40 years of service, calculated according to the formula in the collective bargaining agreement and confirmed in writing by the department's pension administrator at the time of his retirement. He had the letter. He had kept it. He had kept every document related to his pension because Frank Donahue was the kind of man who kept documents and knew where they were and understood that paper was the only thing that stood between what you were promised and what you received when. The people who made the promise were no longer in the room. For 7 years, the pension had arrived on the first of every month without interruption. $3,100, reliable as the first of the month itself, and Frank had built his retirement around it. He had a modest house, paid off in the final years of his career. He had a truck that he maintained himself because he had always maintained his own vehicles and saw no reason to change. He had a vegetable garden in the backyard that he tended with the same methodical attention he had given to everything else in his life. He had his health, reasonably good for a 71-year-old man who had spent 40 years in smoke and heat. And he had his routine and his neighbors and the Tuesday morning coffee he had with 3 retired colleagues at the diner on Prospect Street where they had been meeting for 9 years. He had a life, a quiet, earned, sufficient life built on 40 years of service and the pension that was its foundation. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April, 18 months before he walked into my courtroom, Frank had received a letter from the Millbrook City Pension Administration Office. The letter informed him that a review of departmental pension records had identified a discrepancy in his service calculation. Specifically, the review had found that a 3-month period in 1989 had been incorrectly recorded in his service file, resulting in an overstatement of his total service by 1 quarter. Under the terms of the pension formula, this discrepancy reduced his calculated pension entitlement by $240 per month. The letter further informed him that as a result of this discrepancy, he had been overpaid by $240 per month for the 7 years since his retirement. The total overpayment was $20,160. The pension office intended to recover this overpayment by reducing his monthly pension to $2,860 per month until the overpayment balance was recovered in full. The reduction would begin on the first of the following month. Frank had read the letter at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. He had read it the way he read everything, carefully and completely, before he allowed himself to respond to it. He had set it down when he finished. He had sat for a while. Then he had gone to the filing cabinet in his spare bedroom where he kept his documents, and he had pulled out the folder labeled pension, and he had spent 3 hours going through every piece of paper in it. He had found what he was looking for, a performance evaluation from 1989, signed by his lieutenant and dated within the 3-month period in question, evaluating him as a firefighter in active service. The evaluation was dated in the middle of the period the pension office claimed he had not been in service. He had also found his pay stubs from that period, which he had kept because Frank Donahue kept everything, showing 31 consecutive weeks of firefighter salary without interruption. He had called the pension office the following morning. He had spoken to an administrator named Kevin Briggs, who had been polite and efficient and had told Frank that the discrepancy was based on official departmental records, and that if Frank believed the records were incorrect, he would need to submit a formal appeal with supporting documentation within 60 days. Frank had said he had the documentation. Kevin Briggs had said to submit it with the appeal form, which was available on the pension office website. Frank had submitted the appeal. He had included the performance evaluation and the pay stubs and a letter explaining what they showed, and asking the pension office to review them against whatever records had generated the discrepancy. He had submitted it 14 days after receiving the original letter, well within the 60-day window by certified mail with return receipt requested because Frank Donahue understood the importance of proof of delivery. The pension office had acknowledged receipt of the appeal. Then they had reduced his pension on the first of the following month as stated in the original letter, without waiting for the appeal to be resolved, because their policy was to implement adjustments on schedule regardless of pending appeals. Frank had called Kevin Briggs again. Kevin Briggs had told him that the adjustment had been implemented per standard procedure and that the appeal was under review and that he would receive a response within 90 days. Frank had said that the adjustment was reducing his income while his documentation showed the reduction was not warranted and that 90 days was a long time to absorb an incorrect reduction. Kevin Briggs had said he understood Frank's concern and that the review process would be as expeditious as possible. 90 days had passed. Frank had not received a response. He had called. Kevin Briggs had told him the review was ongoing and that additional documentation had been requested from the Departmental Records Office. Frank had asked what documentation. Kevin Briggs had said he was not able to share the specifics of the internal review process. Another 60 days had passed. Frank had called again. Kevin Briggs was no longer assigned to his case. A new administrator named Patricia Cole had told him the appeal was still under review and that he would receive a written response when the review was complete. Frank had asked how long that would be. Patricia Cole had said she was not able to give a specific timeline. 6 months after Frank's initial appeal, the pension office had sent a letter. The letter informed him that the appeal had been reviewed and denied. The review had determined that the official departmental records were accurate and that the documentation Frank had submitted, while noted, did not override the official record of service. The pension adjustment would remain in effect, and the overpayment recovery would continue until the full balance was recovered. Frank had read that letter at his kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon. He had read it twice. Then he had done something he had not done since the day Margaret, his wife of 38 years, had died 6 years earlier. He had put his head in his hands at his kitchen table and he had sat there for a long time. Margaret had died of a stroke, quickly and without warning, on a Wednesday morning, while Frank was at the Tuesday coffee at the diner on Prospect Street. He had come home and found her, and he had called the ambulance, and he had ridden with her to the hospital, and she had died 4 hours later without regaining consciousness. He had sat beside her for those 4 hours, and he had talked to her because he did not know what else to do. And he had told her things he had meant to say for 38 years, and had assumed he would have more time to say. He had not had more time. He had had 4 hours. He had sold the house they had shared and bought a smaller one, because the house they had shared was too full of her absence to be livable, and he had needed walls that did not remember her in every room. He had his garden and his truck and his Tuesday mornings on Prospect Street, and his pension, and his sufficient quiet life, and he had been managing. He had been doing what Frank Donahue always did. He had been showing up and doing the work and managing. And now someone in an office he had never visited had looked at a record he had never seen and decided that 3 months of his 40 years did not count and had started taking $240 a month from the pension he had earned with his body and his years, and the parts of himself that fire takes and does not give back. He had contacted Diana Park, the same Diana Park who had represented Eleanor Marsh, who had a 4-year practice and a genuine indignation at injustice that had not yet been worn down by the years of work that eventually wears it down in most people. Diana had reviewed the documents and had filed suit against the Millbrook City Pension Administration Office and the Millbrook City Fire Department within 3 weeks of Frank walking through her door. The city was represented by 2 attorneys from the city solicitor's office. The lead attorney was a woman named Helen Garrett, who was experienced and composed and had the practice neutrality of someone who represents institutions rather than people, and has learned to keep those 2 things in separate compartments. She arranged her files without looking at Frank. She had a thick binder and the organized preparation of someone who had been in many courtrooms and expected to leave this one the same way she had left all the others. Diana Park sat beside Frank with her own files and the focused energy of someone who had spent 3 months preparing for a case she was certain about. Frank sat between them with his hands flat on the table and his dark blue suit, and the exhaustion in his face that was the exhaustion of 18 months of fighting, something that should never have required fighting. I opened the file. Frank Donahue, you are the plaintiff in a civil action against the Millbrook City Pension Administration Office and the Millbrook City Fire Department alleging incorrect reduction of your pension entitlement and improper recovery of alleged overpayments totaling $20,160. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings today? Frank said, yes, Your Honor. He said it quietly and directly, the way a man says yes when he has been saying it and meaning it his entire life and is not about to change now. Miss Garrett, please present the city's position. Helen Garrett stood and was thorough and composed for 6 minutes. Official departmental records showed a gap in Frank Donahue's service record during the 3-month period in question. The pension formula was applied to the official record. The calculation produced the adjusted figure. The appeal had been reviewed against the official record, and the official record had been upheld. The city had followed all applicable procedures and was legally entitled to recover the overpayment. She sat down. I looked at her. Miss Garrett, the official departmental record that shows the gap in Mr. Donahue's service. What form does that record take? She consulted her binder. The service record is maintained in the Departmental Human Resources database, Your Honor. It shows a 3-month gap in the entry for the period in question. I said, "What caused the gap in the entry?" She paused. The city's position is that the gap reflects an accurate record of a period during which Mr. Donahue was not in active service. I said, "I did not ask you what the city's position is about what the gap reflects. I asked what caused the gap in the entry, what created it in the database." Garrett paused again. "The specific origin of the gap has not been determined, Your Honor." I looked at her steadily. The pension office reduced a retired captain's pension by $240 a month, based on a gap in a database entry whose origin has not been determined. "Is that what you are telling me?" Garrett said, "Your Honor, the official record is presumed accurate, absent clear evidence to the contrary. The documentation submitted by Mr. Donahue during the appeal process was considered, but did not rise to the level required to override the official record." I said, "Let us talk about that documentation. Mr. Donahue submitted a performance evaluation from within the disputed period signed by his lieutenant and dated within those 3 months. He submitted consecutive pay stubs covering the entire disputed period showing uninterrupted salary payments. How does the city explain those documents?" Garrett said, "The city's position is that the documents, while not disputed as authentic, may reflect administrative irregularities rather than accurate service records." I set my pen down. "Administrative irregularities," I repeated. "A performance evaluation signed by his lieutenant showing him in active service is an administrative irregularity. Consecutive pay stubs showing him receiving firefighter salary for the full period is an administrative irregularity, and a gap of unknown origin in a database entry is the official record." Garrett said, "Your Honor, the city maintains that the database record represents the most reliable documentation of service status." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I turned to Frank. "Mr. Donahue," I said, "tell me about the 3 months in question. The period from February to April of 1989. He looked at me. He said, "Your Honor, I was working. I was on shift at Station 11 the same as every other month of those years. I have the evaluation from Captain Morrison, who was my lieutenant at the time, and I have the pay stubs. I was working." I said, "Do you have any idea what might have caused the gap in the departmental database?" He said, "Your Honor, I found out 6 weeks ago what caused it." He reached into the folder in front of him and produced a document. He said, "I submitted a public records request to the city. It took 11 weeks to get a response. This is what they sent me." He stood slowly and walked to the bench and placed the document in front of me. Then he walked back and sat down and looked at his hands for a moment, and then looked back at me with the clear, steady eyes of a man who has been waiting a long time for the right person to read the right piece of paper. I looked at the document. It was a public records response from the city's Information Technology Department. It contained a maintenance log from the Departmental Human Resources database. I read it carefully. Then I read it again. The maintenance log showed that on a date in June of 1989, 2 months after the disputed period ended, the Departmental Human Resources database had undergone a system migration. During the migration, a data transfer error had affected records for 47 employees. The error had resulted in gaps in the service records of those employees covering various periods. The IT department had identified the error at the time of the migration and had flagged it for manual correction. A corrective action had been logged. The log showed the corrective action as completed. But attached to the public records response was a second document, a follow-up audit report from 2 years after the migration. The audit had found that the corrective action logged as completed in 1989 had in fact only been partially completed. Records for 31 of the 47 affected employees had been correctly restored. Records for the remaining 16 had not. The audit report had recommended that the remaining 16 records be manually reviewed and corrected. The recommendation had been logged. And then it had sat in the system for 32 years while 16 people went about their lives not knowing that a database error from a system migration in 1989 had quietly recorded 3 months of their service as if it had never happened. Frank Donahue was one of the 16. I set the document down. The courtroom was completely silent. Helen Garrett was looking at the document with an expression that had moved well past professional composure into something that was much closer to the specific discomfort of someone who is understanding in real time the full dimensions of what they have been asked to defend. I said, "Miss Garrett." She looked up. I said, "This maintenance log and audit report, were these documents produced in discovery?" She consulted her binder. She consulted it for longer than the question required. She said, "Your Honor, the city produced all responsive documents in discovery." I said, "This document is a public records response to a request Mr. Donahue filed himself 11 weeks ago. Was it produced in discovery?" Garrett said, "Your Honor, the city's discovery production was made in good faith based on documents identified as responsive to the discovery requests as framed." I said, "Miss Garrett, I'm going to ask you one more time. Was this specific document, the IT maintenance log and the audit report attached to it, produced in the city's discovery response?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I do not believe that specific document was included in the production, Your Honor." I said, "You do not believe it was included?" She said, "It was not included, Your Honor." I looked at her steadily. A retired firefighter has been fighting for 18 months to recover his full pension. Your client has known for 18 months that there was a 1989 database migration that caused errors in service records for 16 employees. Your client has known for 18 months that an audit 2 years later found the correction had not been completed for all affected records. And your client did not produce that information in discovery. Garrett opened her mouth. I held up one hand. I stood up from the bench. Frank Donahue looked up at me. He looked at me the way he had looked at me since he sat down, with the clear, exhausted eyes of a man who has been waiting 18 months for this moment and is not entirely sure yet whether it is going to be what he needs it to be. I wanted him to know. I wanted him to see it in my face before I said the words. I said, "Millbrook City Pension Administration Office and the Millbrook City Fire Department. Here is this court's ruling. The pension reduction applied to Frank Donahue's pension is reversed immediately and in full. His pension is restored to $3,100 per month, effective the 1st of next month. The city will repay to Frank Donahue every dollar recovered from his pension over the previous 18 months. That amount is $4,320. The city will pay that amount within 10 business days." I paused. "That is not all," I said. "The city will also pay damages for 18 months of incorrect pension reduction, for the cost of legal representation required to pursue a claim that should never have needed to be pursued, and for the failure to produce relevant documentation in discovery. The total damages award is $75,000. Frank Donahue will receive a total payment from the city of $79,320 within 30 business days. Furthermore," I said, "I am ordering the city to conduct an immediate review of the records of all 16 employees identified in the 1989 audit as having incomplete corrections to their service records. Every one of those employees, or their surviving families if they are deceased, is entitled to know whether their records are accurate. The city has 30 days to complete that review and 90 days to report the results to this court. If the review is not completed within those timelines, I will refer this matter to the State Pension Oversight Board with a recommendation for formal investigation." Garrett was writing quickly. She had the contained focus of someone who has received a ruling they did not expect and is already processing the implications. She was not going to argue it. She had nothing left to argue with. I turned to Frank. He was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table. He was looking at me, and something in his face had changed. The exhaustion was still there. It would probably be there for a while. 18 months of fighting something that should never have required fighting leaves a mark that a single morning in a courtroom cannot fully remove. But underneath the exhaustion, something else had risen. Something that had been pressed down for a long time under the weight of the fighting and was coming up now slowly and carefully, the way something comes up when it has learned to be careful about hope. I said, "Mr. Donahue, do you have anything you would like to say?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands briefly. Then he looked up at me. He said, "Your Honor, I want to say something about the department, about the fire department. Not about the pension office or the lawyers or any of that. About the department itself." I nodded. "Go ahead," he said. "I gave that department 40 years. I gave it my knees, and probably some years off the back end of my life from the smoke. And I gave it the best of what I had every shift for 40 years. He paused, and I want to be clear that I do not regret a single day of it. Not one. The work was real, and it mattered, and the people I worked with were the finest people I have known in my life, and none of what happened with the pension changes any of that." He said, "What I want the department to understand is this. When you tell a man that 3 months of his 40 years didn't happen, you are not telling him about a database entry. You are telling him that 3 months of his life didn't happen. You are telling him that the shifts he worked and the calls he ran and the fires he went into during those 3 months, that none of it counted. And for a man who gave everything he had to a job for 40 years, being told that any part of it didn't count is not a small thing. It is not a clerical matter. It is something that goes to the center of who he is and what his life meant." He was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was completely quiet around him. He said, "I just wanted someone to understand that. Before this was over, I wanted someone in a position to hear it, to actually hear it." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Mr. Donahue, I hear it. This court hears it. Every day of those 40 years counted. Every shift and every call and every fire and every person you brought out of a building that they would not have come out of without you. Every day of it counted, and the record of this court will reflect that from this day forward." He pressed his lips together once. He nodded. He said, "Thank you, Your Honor." He said it the way Frank Donahue said everything, quietly and completely, and meaning every word of it. 4 weeks later, the city paid. The full $79,320 arrived in Frank's account on a Wednesday morning. He called Diana Park when he saw it. Diana Park, who had been practicing for 4 years and who had now won 2 cases that had not made her rich and had made her exactly the kind of attorney she had gone to law school to become. She did not cry this time. She sat at her desk for a few minutes and then she went back to work, because there was more work to do and there always would be. Frank called his daughter in the afternoon. She had driven 4 hours to be with him the night he received the denial letter 18 months earlier, and had sat at his kitchen table with him until late in the evening and had not tried to tell him it was going to be all right. Because she had not known if it was going to be all right, and she was her father's daughter, and her father's daughter did not say things she did not know to be true. When he called her that Wednesday afternoon and told her, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad," and he said, "Yeah," and that was enough. He wrote me a letter 2 weeks later. It was 3 pages written in the large, clear handwriting of a man whose hands have done physical work his whole life and hold a pen the way they hold tools, purposefully and without self-consciousness. He wrote, "Your Honor, I want to tell you about Tuesday mornings. Every Tuesday morning for 9 years, I have had coffee with 3 retired colleagues at the diner on Prospect Street. We have been doing it since the year after I retired. We talk about the department and our families and the neighborhood and what we are reading and whatever is in the news, and sometimes we do not talk about anything in particular, and that is fine too. It is just Tuesday morning. It is just coffee. It is just being somewhere with people who know who you are." He wrote, "During the 18 months I was fighting this, I kept going to those Tuesday mornings. I kept going even on the mornings I did not want to go, because staying home felt like letting the thing beat me, and I was not going to let it beat me. But I will tell you honestly, Your Honor, that those Tuesday mornings were harder during those 18 months than they had been before. Because sitting across from men who spent their careers the same as I spent mine, and knowing that someone had decided a piece of my career had not happened, that changed something about how I sat in that diner. It changed something about how I felt about my own story. He had added a final paragraph. He wrote, "I went to Tuesday morning, 2 days after your ruling. I sat down with my coffee, and I looked at the 3 men across from me who have known me for 30 years, and I did not say anything about the case because I did not need to. They knew. They had known the whole time. And what I felt sitting there that Tuesday morning was something I had not felt in 18 months. I felt like my 40 years were mine again. Fully mine. All of them. Every shift, every call, every day. Mine." I put that letter in my desk drawer. It sits beside Eleanor Marsh's yellow legal pad pages, and Thomas Callahan's letter, and Rose Callahan's blue envelope, and a child's drawing of a stegosaurus, and a bookmark made with shaking hands. It sits there with all the evidence that this bench does what it is supposed to do. Frank Donahue spent 40 years going into burning buildings. He did it because the work mattered, and because someone had to do it, and because he was the kind of man who understood that the most important question is not whether the work is hard, but whether it needs doing. He retired with his pension, and his sufficient quiet life, and the Tuesday mornings on Prospect Street, and the vegetable garden, and the truck he maintained himself, and he asked for nothing more than what he had earned. And then a database entry from a system migration in 1989 reached across 32 years and took $240 a month from a 71-year-old retired firefighter, and told him 3 months of his 40 years had not happened. He did not accept that. He went to his filing cabinet, and he found his documents, and he submitted his appeal, and when the appeal was denied, he filed a public records request, and he waited 11 weeks for the response, and when it came, he put it in a folder, and he walked into my courtroom, and he placed it on my bench, and he waited for someone to read it. I read it, and it changed everything, because the truth always does, every single time, without exception, because that is what the truth is for. That is what this bench is for. Not to punish the powerful for the pleasure of it, not to reward the vulnerable for the sympathy of it, to read the document, to ask the question nobody else has asked, to find the thing that has been buried in the file for 32 years and hold it up in the light and say, this is what happened, and this is what we are going to do about it. Frank Donahue's 40 years are his. All of them. Every shift, every call, every fire. Every Tuesday morning in a diner on Prospect Street with 3 men who know who he is and have always known and never needed a database to tell them. That is the record of this court. And it will stand.